10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
We danced in the rain under broken skies, laughed through the pain, hid behind our lies. I thought we were strong, thought we'd never break.
Hey guys, welcome to Holey Smokes, Holey Smokes, where we view all things through the eyes of Jesus. Today we visit with Ben Shapiro, and we'll let him give us his take on whether he believes that the first two chapters of Genesis should be taken literally or allegorically. What do you think? Comment down below, let us know. Let's get into it.
As a man of faith, you said you accept the principles of macroevolution, and I wanted to know, as a man of faith, how do you reconcile Darwinian evolution with a belief in Genesis? And as one who literally interprets the book of Genesis myself, where do you draw the line between an allegorical approach in the literal historical account of Genesis? Where do you draw that line? If it's all not literal, how do you decide what's allegorical versus what's literal? And reconciling that with Darwinian evolution in your...
Okay, guys, here's the truth. The first two chapters of Genesis, and for the most part, the entire Bible, is not figurative. There are figurative parts in the Bible, but even those figurative parts, the meaning that you take from it is literal, and you're supposed to apply it that way. The Word of God, more so than anything, are commandments, and they're commandments to me, you, and everybody that follows Jesus Christ. And so those commandments are directions in order for us to get from one place to another, from sin to righteousness, in order for us to get from the garden back to the garden, or in order for us to get from Genesis to Revelation. If you want to know God's will for us, it's in the garden. That's God's will for us. And it's also in the millennium when Jesus returns. Everything in between is as a result of Adam and Eve sinning and sin entering the world. And so what God does as your Father who loves you is he actually throws you a lifeline, which is the Word in Jesus Christ. And that's the way in which we get back to the garden, through his own sacrifice to pay for all of our sins. So in other words, in order for you to get from one place to another, those directions or commandments could not be figurative. If they're figurative, it actually defeats the entire purpose of the commandment. If it's figurative, then everybody's going to take whatever they want to take out of it. And that's not the objective truth. I know the world will say that you have your truth, I have my truth, he has his truth. But that's not the objective truth. That's not the truth that comes from God. Remember, Jesus is the Word. The Word was made flesh. Jesus came back the first time and he reconciled the Word to the nation of Israel. But he didn't come back to judge. He came back to save. He gave grace. When he comes back the second time, he will also reconcile the Word, but to judgment. And so what I think and what you think, what the other person thinks, separate from what God's truth is, really doesn't matter, because he created everything. And so if you're ever going to find out the truth about a product that's been created, what do? The best way to do that is to go back to the Creator. The Creator knows the purpose and what is good and bad for that creation. And so the Word has to be literal. It's how we get from a place of sin to a place of everlasting life. Those are directions, and those directions have to be taken literally.
Okay, so the way that I draw an allegorical approach to particularly the first couple of chapters of Genesis is because the first couple chapters of Genesis, in my opinion, are obviously written with an eye toward allegory. So, for example, it says at the beginning of the book of Genesis, by Yom Echad, right? This is the day one, right? And then it'll say that there was day two. Well, so first of all, God creates light before he creates the sun.
So the question is, did God create life before he created the sun? And the answer is no. And it's very clearly no if you actually just read the plain text of Genesis in chapter 1, verses 3 through 5. It says, and I'm paraphrasing, God said, let there be light, and there was light, and he used the darkness for night, and that was the first day. So wrapped up in those 3 verses, and I'm going to put that for you guys on the screen so you guys can actually see the verses and you can follow along. But read verses 3 through 5, you see wrapped up in those 3 verses are what? He talked about the light, which is the sun. How do we know that that's the sun? We know that's the sun because if you go down to verse 16, it'll say, and God made 2 great lights. And we know that from the perspective of the earth, the great light is what? Is the sun. The earth cannot exist without the sun. You cannot have life without the sun. And so within that, he's also talking about the evening and he's talking about the day. The day and the evening is spoken to from the earth perspective. So within the first day, he's saying that the sun existed, the stars existed, and the earth existed. That's the only way you can have an evening and a day. The earth orbits around the sun, and as it orbits around the sun, it rotates on its axis, and you have an evening and you have a day. So God is saying within the first day, not within the 4th day, that he created the sun. And to prove that, if you go to Job chapter 38, verses 4 through 7, and again, I'm going to put this one on the screen so you guys can see it, you guys can follow it. It's in the Old Testament, but we're going to focus here on verse 4, and we're going to focus on verse 7, okay? And I'm paraphrasing here, but basically he's saying from the foundations of the universe, from the foundations of the world, he was measuring for the world. And as he was doing that, in verse 7, it says, while the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy. So what God is telling Job in these verses here, he's telling them from the foundation of the world, from the foundation of the universe.
The stars existed and the sun existed.
Right? So the foundational day of the 6 days of creation is what? Is the first day. The things that happened after the first day and the second day, the 3rd day, the 4th day, and the 6th day, and the 7th day couldn't happen unless the first day happened. And so when God creates anything, he creates it the same way. He plants the seed, he sows the seed, and then you have the increase. And so what God is saying is within that foundational day, the stars already existed. Let me say it again. Verse 7, while the morning stars sang together, all the angels shouted for joy. Job is saying that the stars, the sun, were singing and shouting for joy in the first day from the foundations of the world. So God is saying in Genesis that the sun, the stars, and the earth all existed within the first day. It wasn't created on the 4th day. It was created on the first day. Okay, so you say, okay, if that's true, then what was God speaking about in verse 14? And so let's go back to Genesis and let's dive into that. And let me tell you what God was speaking about in verse 14. Now, those answers could be found in 3 simple words. In verse 5, it's the word light. You see that? And God called the light day. Genesis chapter 1, verse 5. I'll put that up on the screen again. And then it can be found in verse 14 where it says, and God said, let there be lights. You see that? That's the second word it can be found in, lights. And then if you go down to verse 17, the answer can be found in, and God set. You see that? So there's 3 words here. There's light, there's lights, and there's set. So you ask, hey, well, what do these have to do with the answer as to what God was speaking of in verse 14? Well, first of all, we know that the light in verse 3 through 5 is the same light that God is speaking about in verse 14 through 17. Why do we know that? Because he speaks of those lights as being the greater lights and the lesser lights. And so we know that that is the light that gives life to the earth. Without that light, without the sun, there is no life on earth. So that we know that that light in verse 3 and through 5 and 14 through 17 are exactly the same light. But if you dig a little deeper and you investigate a little harder and you start to look into the original language in which the book of Genesis was written, which is the Hebrew language, you'll find that the word light and lights are 2 different words. So you ask yourself, well, then why did God use 2 different words if they're the same light? Well, it's the same light, and I can prove that in the Hebrew, because in verse 5, that word light is actually or, O-R, okay? It actually means light, that's what it means. And so in verse 14, it's used as lights, and in the Hebrew, It's spelled Maor, M-A-O-R. And so that Ma is a prefix. It's what we call a locative prefix. It's a group of letters that are connected to a word that gives it a specific or different meaning than the word if it were just by itself. And the locative speaks to the location. And so it's the same light, but now it's speaking to a location, specific location. And how do we know that? Because if you look down in verse 17, what does it say? God set and placed the light, right? So it's the same light, but now God is taking it from verse 3 and verse 5, and he's going into verse 14 through 17, and now he's setting it and he's placing it. Do you see that? You see that? And science agrees with God. You know why? Because science says that the sun was not birthed in the same location that it is today. The sun traveled a long distance to be where it is today. And based on the gravitational pull of all the surrounding planets within the solar system and the gravitational pull from the sun itself, the sun today is no longer traveling as it was. The sun today is fixed and it's set in the proper location to give the light and the power and the life to the world that God called it to do in verse 14 through 17, but didn't have the power to do in 3 through 5. You see that? So in 3 through 5, it's the same light, but over time, over the maturing of the sun and the distance that was traveled and the creation of all the planets, God now set it where it needs to be so it could nourish the earth in the way that God called it to nourish the earth in verses 14 through 17. You see that? Okay, now there's one other point to this. And the other point is, as you can see in verse 5, God says light, and in verse 14, he says lights, right? So why does he use light and why does he use lights? It's the same word meaning or, right? Meaning light, but he speaks to lights in verse 14 because he speaks to the
Power and the number of lights.
that it didn't have in verses 3 through 5. So science actually agrees with God because science says that when the sun was birthed, it was born as an infant. And in its infancy stage, it didn't have the same power that it has today. So theory is that in its infancy stage, that the sun only gave off about 70% of the rays that you see today, or the power that it sees today. Over time, the sun gathered power and it moved and it was set in the place that it needed to be set, that God set it in verse 14 through 17 to do what? To nourish the earth and give us days, years, seasons, and so forth. It didn't have that power back in 3 and 5. So the answer is, it wasn't strong enough to do it in 3 through 5, and it wasn't set in the place that it needed to do it in 3 through 5. But it was in 14 through 17. So it's the same exact light, but it wasn't ready to do the work in 3 through 5 that God called it to do in 14 through 17. So you see that God did not create the sun in 14. That's not what happened. He created the sun in the first day. But as the sun gained strength, as the sun moved from one place to another, God set it where it needs to be, as it says in verse 17, and it was able to do God's will as God calls it to do in verses 14 through 17. So the answer is no. God did not create life before he created the sun. God created the sun, the earth, and the stars in the first day before he created life in the third day. That's the answer.
There's no. Second of all, how do you measure the length of a day when there is no sun and no earth?
God measured the length of the day because the sun already existed. In the first day, God created the stars, the sun, and the earth. And so when God said, and God called the light day and the darkness night, and the evening and the morning were the first day, you know what, guys? He wasn't lying. Hey guys, like, comment, and subscribe, and push this video all over social media. And check out part 2 of Ben Shapiro versus God I'll see you on the other side.